For 30 years, I had poured everything into raising my son, believing that one day he would see me not just as a provider, but as a person. That thought was still in my mind the afternoon I came home from work and began sorting through the pile of mail left by the door. Most of it was the usual mix of overdue bills and glossy flyers I would throw away without a second glance. But tucked in the middle was one envelope that felt different. The paper was heavier, the surface slightly rough under my fingertips, the kind of envelope you knew cost more than you would ever spend on something as simple as mail. I thought maybe it was some new promotion from a real estate company, but when I opened it and read the words printed in gold across the cream background, my hands began to tremble. Mr. and Mrs. Michael Harris request the honour of your presence. My son was getting married. That was how I found out. No phone call, no excited visit to share the news, not even a hurried voicemail. Just a card that could have been addressed to a distant relative or a business associate. I read it again slower this time, hoping I had misunderstood. But the names were there, bold and certain, and the date too. The 15th of June. A moment that was supposed to be shared between a mother and her only child had arrived instead like a bill tucked between coupons. I set the invitation down on the kitchen table next to the stack of envelopes I had been avoiding. For a while, I just sat there staring at it. The words blurred as my eyes filled with tears. It should have been different. I should have heard his voice first. I should have been the one he wanted to see when he told the world he was ready to start a new life. Instead, I felt like I had been quietly moved to the edge of his story. My heart ached in that familiar way that never fully leaves the chest of a mother. As I stared at the gold lettering, I began to think back over the years. I remembered Michael, at 6 years old, his head resting on the kitchen table while I worked late into the night, typing reports I had brought home just to cover the rent. I remembered skipping meals so he would have enough to eat. I remembered standing in the rain on the sidelines of his soccer games, cheering louder than anyone else so he would know I was there. All those nights and mornings, I had told myself it was worth it, that one day he would look back and understand what it meant to be loved like that. And now, here I was holding proof that in his eyes I was no more than an obligation. My thoughts turned to Claire, the young woman he was marrying. I had met her only a handful of times. She was polite enough, but I could see the way she glanced around my small apartment, taking in the second-hand furniture, and the curtains I had stitched myself when I could not afford new ones. She had called it cosy, but her smile had been too thin to hide the truth. I knew in that moment that I did not belong in her world, and perhaps she had made sure that Michael saw me the same way. I pressed the card flat with my hand and let out a slow breath. The words on the page seemed to glow under the kitchen light, but instead of feeling proud, I felt reduced. A name on cardstock, nothing more. Not the woman who had once had dreams of her own, not the person who had worked and prayed and carried a child through every hardship, just a name printed to fulfill a duty. I picked up a small magnet from the refrigerator and placed the invitation there as though it were a school award. Once I used to line the fridge with drawings and report cards, each one proof that my boy was growing. Now the only thing that hung there was a card that reminded me how far he had gone without me. I stood in the quiet of my kitchen and looked at the phone on the counter. The screen was dark. Part of me wanted to call him immediately to hear his voice, to ask why. Another part of me hesitated, afraid of what I might hear in his tone. Was I still his mother, or had I been pushed so far to the side that I was no longer needed? I placed my hand on the phone, but did not pick it up. Instead, I whispered to myself, barely louder than a breath, that maybe I would call tomorrow. I told myself there was time, though. Deep down, I knew the distance between us was already wide. The refrigerator hummed behind me, steady and uncaring, and I stood there listening to it until the stillness of the apartment became unbearable. I went to bed, with the invitation still pinned in plain view, its gold letters shining faintly even in the dark, a reminder that the world I had built for my son no longer included me at the center. When morning came, the first thing I saw was that same card staring back at me from the refrigerator. I stood there holding my coffee cup, watching it as though it might change if I looked long enough. It did not. It only reminded me that if I wanted to hear my son's voice, I would have to make the call myself. My hand hovered over the phone for a long time. Part of me told myself to wait, that he should be the one to call me. But I knew if I stayed silent, I would remain nothing more than a name on paper. So I dialed. Each ring stretched out until it felt like a question I did not want answered. On the third ring, his voice came through. "Hey, Mom!" He sounded rushed, distracted, as though he was already somewhere else. I forced myself to sound cheerful. I told him the invitation had arrived, that it was beautiful, that I was so proud of him. He said, "Good, glad it got to you." No warmth, just acknowledgement. I tried to keep the conversation going to build some small bridge between us. I said I would love to help with the planning. Maybe flowers, maybe tasting the cake. Just something that would let me feel a part of his day. There was a pause, and then his tone sharpened. "Mum, stop. It's all taken care of. Claire's parents are handling everything." My heart sank. I told him I wasn't talking about money, only about being involved, about standing next to him in some way, the way mothers usually do. He sighed, and I could almost hear him rubbing his forehead. "Mum, everything has to look polished, not like..." He stopped himself, but I heard what he meant. Not like me, not like my life. In that silence, I remembered every night I had worked overtime, every double and triple shift I had taken, so he could have shoes for school, so he could go on class trips, so he would never feel the sting of being the poor kid. I told him softly, "Do you remember how many nights I stayed at the office so you'd have what you needed?" He cut me off. "That was the past, Mum. Let's not go over all that again." The words stung more than I expected. I wanted to remind him that the past was the reason he stood where he was today, but I swallowed it. I told myself that if I argued, it would only push him further away. He added quickly, "Just wear something nice, but not too conservative. Claire's family is traditional." I forced myself to say, "Of course, I understand, I'll be there." Before I could say anything more, he ended the call. The line went dead. I sat in the silence of my kitchen, with the phone still warm in my hand. I whispered to no one, optional perhaps, but so was I. I pressed the phone to my chest, trying to calm the shaking in my hands. In that moment, I felt both smaller than ever and strangely resolved. If he wanted me to hide in the corner, I would still walk into that room with dignity. If all I was to him was a seat filler at a table by the kitchen, then at least I would choose how I walked in and how I looked when I sat down. I set the phone down and caught my reflection in the dark screen. For a second, I thought I saw not just a mother, but a woman staring back, one who still had choices left. That thought stayed with me through the night, and when I woke the next morning, it was still there, steady as my own heartbeat. If I had to sit in the shadows at my son's wedding, then at least I would walk in with dignity. I could not change the way they placed me on the edges of their new life, but I could decide how I carried myself when I walked through those doors. That choice was mine. I opened my wallet and saw what little I had, not enough for anything grand, but I knew I could make it stretch if I was willing to sacrifice. I began by cutting the small things, skipping a bus ride and walking. Instead, choosing soup over a full meal, cancelling the cable that had been my company in the evenings. Each time I held back, I told myself, this is not for him, this is for me. For years I had done without so Michael could have what he needed. Now for the first time, the giving up was not to keep him afloat, but to give me back a little pride. I wrote each saved dollar in a small notebook, and with every line, the weight in my chest lifted, just enough for me to breathe easier. When I finally had enough, I went to a department store I had only ever passed by. The floors gleamed, and the racks were filled with dresses that looked too fine for someone like me. I almost turned back, But then a clerk approached, holding up a gown in deep emerald green. The colour caught my breath. It was bold, not hidden, and something inside me wanted it. I looked at the price and felt my stomach twist. But then I thought of the weeks of walking the skipped meals, the nights alone with nothing but silence. I handed over the money. Carrying the bag home, I felt as though I was carrying proof that I could still belong somewhere, even if only in my own eyes. At home, I slipped the dress on and stood in front of my mirror. It was beautiful, but unfinished. My greying hair, pulled back the same way for years, dulled the glow. I made an appointment at a salon, my first in more than a decade. Sitting in the chair cape fastened around me, I felt exposed, almost foolish. The stylist worked quietly, combing, trimming, adding soft curls, and a hint of colour. When she finally turned me toward the mirror, I gasped. The woman staring back at me had light in her eyes, her hair full of movement, her dress flowing like it had been waiting all this time. For a long moment, I did not recognise her. Then, slowly I whispered, "This is not just Michael's mum. This is Linda, a woman." The words felt like a promise. I went home and hung the gown carefully in my closet. I touched the fabric and let myself breathe deeply, as though I was taking in strength from the threads themselves. I told myself that, no matter what seat they gave me at that wedding, I would sit in it with my head high. I would not let them see me bowed. For the first time in a long while, I felt the smallest ember of hope warming me. I was no longer only someone waiting to be called on. I was preparing to step into that room as myself. That thought carried me to the morning of the wedding. I slipped into the emerald gown I had guarded like a secret, fastened the small silver earrings I had owned for years, and looked at my reflection. For a moment, I believed I belonged. I held on to that belief as I drove my old car up the circular driveway of the Magnolia Hill Country Club. The grounds stretched wide with manicured lawns, the air heavy with the scent of roses. Luxury cars lined the entrance, their paint gleaming in the sunlight. My Honda, washed carefully the night before, looked out of place, but I parked it anyway and stepped out as though it did not matter. Inside, marble floors shone under crystal chandeliers. My heels clicked loudly on the polished surface, and every sound reminded me how small I was in this world. I followed the crowd until I saw him. Michael stood near the staircase in his black tuxedo hair, styled just right, smile wide as he listened to Claire's father. He looked taller somehow, as if the world had already accepted him as one of its own. Beside him, Claire glowed in her wedding gown, her skin lit by every flash of the cameras. Together, they looked as though they belonged on the cover of a magazine, polished and untouchable. My chest tightened with both pride and dread. I walked toward them, rehearsing the words in my head. Michael's eyes found mine, and his smile faltered. Not with warmth, but with something guarded. "Mom, you made it," he said, voice even. I told him he looked handsome, and, without thinking, I reached to straighten his bow tie the way I had done since he was a boy. He stepped back slightly, breaking the contact. "Thanks," he said after a pause. "You look nice." The word landed with a sting, polite but empty. Before I could answer, a man turned toward me with an extended hand. "You must be Michael's mother. Thomas Whitmore." His grip was firm, his smile practiced. I told him it was a pleasure, that he had gained a fine son-in-law. "Indeed," he said, his eyes already drifting back to Michael. I stood there for another beat, invisible again, before stepping aside. Cameras flashed, and Evelyn moved swiftly, directing the photographer. She leaned in close, her voice low, but not low enough. "Do not take too many shots of her. She does not fit our family image." I froze, certain I had misheard, but the way she turned her back confirmed it. My cheeks burned, as though every guest in the room had heard the same words. I wanted to protest, to claim my place as his mother, but no sound came. I simply stood there with my hands folded in front of me, wishing for the ground to steady beneath my feet. Around me, gowned, shimmered men, in tailored suits laughed easily, and I felt the careful curls in my hair collapse under the weight of the moment. My emerald dress suddenly seemed too loud, as though it drew attention not to dignity, but to the gap between us. I had thought I could walk in as myself, but here myself was something to be hidden. The crowd shifted toward the ballroom for photos. I tried to join, but found myself pushed to the edge. Michael leaned in for picture after picture, with Claire's family, with his friends from college, with everyone except me. I waited, hoping someone would call me forward, but no one did. The photographer's lens passed over me as if I was not even there. I stepped back slowly out of the circle of light until I was standing near the far wall. From there, I watched my son laugh with his new family, his smile wide and easy. Pride and sorrow battled inside me, but sorrow won. I whispered to myself I had prepared to walk in as myself, but in his world myself was never invited. Just then, an usher came toward me with a polite smile and asked if he could show me to my seat. I followed him into the ballroom, my heels clicking against the polished floor as my eyes moved across the tables. Each one, closer to the centre, seemed to sparkle with laughter and chatter. At the head table, Michael and Claire sat in a perfect circle of light, surrounded by her family and friends, everyone glowing with celebration. My heart lifted for a moment as I imagined being seated close enough to see his smile, to hear his voice without straining. But the usher kept walking, weaving past tables filled with Michael's college friends, Claire's sorority sisters, and the Whitmore's closest companions. We passed the laughter and the toasts until we reached the farthest corner, right beside the swinging doors of the kitchen. Here, tucked against the wall, sat table 8, a small round table with half its seats empty, the constant rush of waiters brushing past with trays, and the muffled clatter of dishes behind the doors. The usher gestured politely, and I lowered myself into a chair, folding my hands in my lap. From where I sat, the head table seemed far away, almost another world. I could see Michael's tuxedo gleam in the light, but his laughter barely carried across the room. My eyes stung, but I kept my chin lifted. A few minutes later, a woman in her 60s approached, looking uncertain. She leaned down and asked softly, "Are you Michael's mother?" I nodded, and she smiled warmly. "I am Margaret," she said, "Claire's great aunt. Would you mind if I sat with you? I do not know anyone else here." Relief washed over me. "Of course, please do," I answered. She settled into the chair beside me, smoothing her dress, and leaned in with a conspiratorial whisper. "All of this is very beautiful, but not really my world." I smiled faintly and replied, "It is not mine either. But it is his day, and that is what matters." For a moment, I felt less alone. As the servers moved quickly between tables, one guest from a nearby group tapped my arm and asked if I could bring another glass of water. He had mistaken me for the staff. My cheeks burned as I shook my head gently. "I am not with the staff. I am the groom's mother." His face flushed with embarrassment, and he muttered a quick apology before turning back to his friends. Margaret looked horrified. "That is inexcusable," she whispered. I forced a smile and said quietly, "It is fine," though inside I felt the words like a stone pressing down. I sat there with my glass of water, pretending not to notice how far the music and laughter seemed from where I was placed. Every cheer from the head table sounded like an echo. Margaret tried to keep me company, sharing small stories about her travels and her garden, and I listened gratefully. But the truth was clear. My place had been chosen carefully, and it was not beside my son. It was here in the shadows near the kitchen doors. I lifted my glass of water slowly and whispered to myself, "Here is to being seen, even if only by me." The sound of clinking silverware soon followed as waiters began to serve dinner, gliding between the tables with smooth precision. Plates were set down at the head table, first shining silver domes lifted in unison. Laughter rose from the front as the smell of roasted salmon drifted across the room. I folded my hands on my lap and waited. Table by table, the food made its way across the room, each guest smiling, thanking the servers, raising their forks. At last, the waiters reached the far side, and Margaret's plate was placed before her. Another guest at our table received theirs, then another. My setting remained bare. I told myself it was just a small delay, that the next round of trays would bring mine. 10 minutes passed then, 20. I sipped water, adjusted the folds of my dress, smiled when Margaret glanced at me with sympathy. The clatter of dishes behind the swinging doors was constant, yet none of it reached me. A young waiter approached finally, his face red with nerves. "I am so sorry, ma'am, there was a mix-up in the kitchen. Your meal will be right out." His kindness stung more than indifference. I forced a smile and nodded. "It is fine," I said gently. "Take your time." He hurried away, leaving me alone again with the empty place setting. Around me, the other tables were deep into their meals, the room filled with the scrape of forks and bursts of laughter. My stomach tightened, but worse than hunger was the feeling of being invisible. At last, another server arrived, placing a plate before me with a hurried apology. The salmon was cold, its edges curled. The asparagus sagged, the potatoes clumped together, as though scraped from the bottom of a pan. Margaret leaned closer, whispering, "That is inexcusable." I smiled faintly, though the effort hurt. "It is fine," I said, the words heavy on my tongue. "I am just happy to be here." But the truth was, I had grown used to saying those words, as though repeating them enough could make them true. I picked up my fork and tried to eat each bite dull and tasteless. Halfway through, I heard Michael's voice rise above the music. He was leaning toward Claire, his words carrying just far enough for the nearby tables. "Did you see?" he said with a smirk. "They finally brought my mum her food. She is used to eating what life leaves behind. She will not mind." Claire laughed high and sharp, and a few others joined her, following her lead. I froze fork halfway to my mouth. My son's voice, clear and cutting, echoing in my ears. The laughter rippled outward while I sat in silence, heat burning in my chest, though my hands were steady. I set the fork down. Slowly, carefully, I took the white linen napkin from my lap, folded it in half, and laid it over the plate. It was a quiet gesture, one no one else noticed, but for me it was final. I had spent years telling myself that scraps were enough because they came from him. Scraps of time, scraps of attention, scraps of love. Tonight, I saw the truth. To him, I had never been more than an afterthought, someone meant to take what was left and be grateful for it. Margaret's hand touched mine under the table, her grip gentle but firm. "Are you all right, dear?" she whispered. I met her eyes and forced a smile. "I am fine," I answered softly, though inside something had cracked wide open. The ballroom carried on without me. Toasts rang out. Glasses lifted high, laughter rolled across the floor like a tide that did not reach the corner where I sat. The music swelled, elegant and celebratory, and the servers moved in and out through the swinging doors behind me. At table 8, my plate lay covered untouched, a symbol of what I would no longer accept. I folded my hands once more in my lap and kept my head high, but the weight in my chest was heavy. Humiliation, sorrow, and something else rising beneath them. Something sharper waiting. I thought to myself, tonight, I have reached the bottom. From here, there is nowhere left to sink. The music softened, and the master of ceremonies stepped forward with a broad smile, asking everyone to raise their glasses for the toasts. I stayed seated, as others rose one by one. Evelyn was first. She spoke at length about her daughter's elegance. Her grace, how Claire had been destined for a day like this since she was a little girl. Her words glowed with pride, and the room applauded warmly. Then Thomas lifted his glass and spoke about Michael, praising his career in technology, his discipline, and his potential to carry on the Whitmore family's standards of excellence. I listened to every word, but each one landed like a reminder that the story of my son's life was now theirs to tell, not mine. Laughter and cheers circled the head table, but none of it reached the far corner where I sat, my napkin still covering the plate of cold food I had refused to eat. The MC asked if anyone else wanted to say a few words. For a moment, silence fell heavy. Guests looked around, expecting no one to speak. My chest rose and fell, once slowly, and then I pushed my chair back. The sound scraped across the polished floor, and dozens of heads turned. Margaret touched my wrist, her eyes full of both concern and encouragement. I gave her a small nod and rose to my feet. I lifted my glass, though I held only water, and my voice carried across the room. "Thank you. I began for being here to share this day. It is beautiful, and I am proud to see my son so happy." Polite smiles met my words. A few people clapped lightly, expecting me to sit down after offering a simple blessing. But I did not sit. I paused and let the quiet stretch until every eye was on me. "Some of you laugh," I said, "at my old shoes and my old car. You whisper that I do not fit the picture you want for this family. But remember this. These hands you dismiss, these hands raised the man standing here today. Every long night, every skipped meal, every sacrifice, you cannot imagine they were mine." My voice did not shake. Murmurs rippled across the room, and I saw faces shift uncomfortably. Michael stared at me, jaw tight. Claire's practiced smile flickered. Evelyn folded her hands in her lap, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. I held my glass higher. I am no longer just the shadow behind my son. From today, I live as myself. Not as the invisible guest, not as the quiet mother who accepts scraps, but as a woman who matters. My words came stronger now, fueled by the years of silence. I turned toward Michael. "The trust fund you believed supported you was never a fund at all. It was me. Every dollar came from overtime. Hours from food I went without, from years I gave without complaint. That support ends tonight." Gasps spread across the tables, the sound like a sudden wave crashing. Guests leaned closer to each other, whispering in disbelief. I continued steady as ever. "The house you assumed would someday be yours, I am selling it. I will use that money not for anyone else, but to live the life I still have left." My voice was not loud, but it carried. Each word landed in the heavy silence sharper than the music that had filled the room all evening. I let my eyes rest on each of them. Michael's face was red, his mouth open, but no words came. Claire's hand trembled around the stem of her glass. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line, her posture rigid as though she could still control the picture being painted before her guests. Thomas's polite mask cracked, his gaze darting across the room, searching for a way to recover dignity. But there was none. Their perfect image had fractured in the span of a few sentences, and nothing they did could repair it. Margaret leaned toward me and whispered softly, "Good for you." Her voice was the only one that felt like an embrace in that moment. I lowered my glass and took a sip of water instead of champagne. I had no desire to toast with them. I wanted only to claim my voice after years of letting it be ignored. I sat down slowly, keeping my head high, and folded my hands in my lap once more. The room remained silent. Guests shifted in their seats, so uncertain whether to applaud, to protest, or to look away. I let the silence hold. For years I had begged to be seen, chasing scraps of attention, smiling through neglect. Tonight I had chosen differently. Tonight I had chosen to be heard. And in that silence, heavy and complete, I felt something shift inside me. Not just the end of humiliation, but the beginning of freedom. That thought carried me home after the wedding, but the silence of my small apartment did not last long. The first email arrived the next morning. My son's name glowed on the screen, and for a moment I let myself hope it might be an apology. Instead, I read words that cut sharper than any look he had given me that night. "Mom, what the hell was that? You ruined everything. Do you have any idea how you embarrassed me in front of Claire's family? It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, and you turned it into a spectacle." I sat at the kitchen table staring at the lines, my chest heavy. I read it twice then, a third time, but no amount of rereading softened the meaning. He was angry, not at the years of silence, but at the moment I finally chose to speak. I closed the message without replying. The next day, a co-worker at the office stopped me near the coffee machine. She smiled carefully as though measuring her words and asked if I was doing all right. She said she had overheard someone mention that I had a breakdown at my son's wedding. I forced a polite answer, but inside I understood. Evelyn and Claire were already spreading their version of the night, whispering about me being unstable, turning my truth into gossip to protect their perfect picture. Later that evening, a neighbour knocked on my door. Holding a pie she said was extra. She asked softly, "Are you okay, dear? I heard you had some trouble." I thanked her, smiled, and closed the door. Alone again, I stood with the pie cooling in my hands and realised how fast a rumour could replace reality. Another email came 2 days later, harsher than the first. "Mum, I have talked to a lawyer. You cannot just sell the house. It is my inheritance. If you are not thinking clearly, they will prove it. Do not do something stupid." His words hit harder than the cold plate of food ever had. My son, the child I had raised with everything I had, was now willing to question my sanity to take what he believed was his. I pressed my hand against the screen, as though touching the words could make them less cruel, but nothing softened them. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had balanced bills and written grocery lists, where I had once set down homework sheets for Michael to finish. I whispered to the empty room, so I was only ever allowed to exist as someone's mother, never as Linda. The truth hung in the air heavier than any silence. I thought back to the years of saying no to myself. No to remarriage, no to dreams, no to rest. I had said no again and again because I believed being Michael's mother was enough. But in teaching myself to vanish, I had taught him that I could be treated as invisible. For the first time, I saw that mistake clearly, and I knew I could not keep living that way. So instead of answering his message, I picked up the phone and called a realtor. My voice was steady as I explained that I wanted to list my house. The woman on the other end asked if I was sure, and I said yes. Yes, I am sure. After hanging up, I walked through each room of the house, running my fingers over the furniture, the faded curtains, the photos still hanging on the walls. It was not sadness, I felt. It was a kind of release. Every corner held years of sacrifice, years of waiting for love to be returned. Now, I was ready to let it go. In the days that followed, I took small steps. I called my phone company and arranged to change my number. I filled out forms to reroute my mail. I made lists of what I would keep and what I would leave behind. Each action was small, but each one was mine, and every time I finished one, I felt the faintest spark of strength grow warmer inside me. The rumours still circled. I heard whispers at work, sensed the curious glances of neighbours. But instead of shame, I felt clarity. They could tell whatever story they wanted. They could paint me as unstable, selfish, cruel. The truth was simple. For the first time in 30 years, the choice of who I was did not belong to anyone else. It belonged to me. One evening, I stood by the window, looking out at the quiet street below. The lights in other homes glowed warmly, and I thought of the families inside them gathered around dinners, laughing, living. I whispered to the glass, they can spread lies, they can try to take what is mine, but they cannot take the one thing that matters. For the first time in 30 years, the choice is not theirs, it is mine. That whisper carried me back to the kitchen table, the place where I had balanced bills, filled out permission slips and written checks to cover Michael's needs. Tonight, The table was cleared. No stacks of papers, no calculator, no reminders of what I owed anyone. Only my laptop sat in front of me, its glow cutting through the dark. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat down and stared at the blank screen. For years I had written to banks, to landlords, to insurance companies. Words that explained, pleaded, promised. Tonight my words were for him, but more than that, they were for me. I began simply. Jason, this is not punishment. This is me finally choosing to matter to myself. The keys clicked softly as I wrote, my fingers steady. I told him I had spent years, carrying both of us years, when I skipped meals and worked through the night, so he would never feel the ache of hunger or shame of not belonging. I reminded him that while he was studying for exams, I was filing claims and answering phones, taking every overtime shift that was offered. And I told him that those choices were mine, freely given, but that they had cost me more than he would ever understand. I paused, sipped my tea, and then continued. I will no longer fund your life. I will no longer be your safety net. The house is being sold, and with it goes the weight of expectations that were never mine to carry. You have a wife now, and her family. You have a career, a future, and a circle of people who call you theirs. What you no longer have is me behind the curtain, working in silence to make it all possible. The words came easier now, as if they had been waiting inside me for years. I wrote from, today I am not just a mother. I am me. For so long I thought my name was less important than my role. I thought if I was a good enough mother, it would be enough to fill a life. But in losing myself, I showed you it was acceptable to lose me too. That ends tonight. I remembered every time I had told myself no. No to dinner with friends because the babysitter was too expensive. No to a new dress because tuition needed to be paid. No to the chance of remarriage because I was afraid it would confuse him or make him feel less. No to the person I was before I became his mother. I wrote, I cannot blame you for forgetting me, Jason. I taught you how, but I will not teach you anymore. The room was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I set my fingers back on the keys. You will always be my son, I wrote, but I will no longer beg for your respect. My hope for you is that one day you learn the difference between love and gratitude. Until then, I choose myself. I signed it simply, Mom. I read the letter 3 times, not searching for mistakes, but letting the weight of it settle inside me. I did not feel guilt. I did not feel doubt. Only calm. My hands did not tremble. My heart did not race. At 3:47 in the morning, I pressed send. The screen blinked once, and the words were gone from me and on their way to him. I closed the laptop and sat back in my chair. The quiet of the apartment wrapped around me, but for the first time in years, it did not feel like loneliness. It felt like space. Space that was mine to fill. I looked down at the table, the same table where I had once cut coupons and packed school lunches, and I thought I had lived my whole life writing checks to prove my love. Tonight, I wrote words instead, and they were for me. I carried my empty cup to the sink, rinsed it and left it upside down to dry. Then, I turned out the light. The apartment was dark, but the darkness no longer pressed in. It stretched outward wide and open like the beginning of something instead of the end. I held that thought close as I packed my life into neat boxes, signed the papers that set me free, and drove south with the windows cracked, just enough to taste new air. When I reached Savannah, I found a small place a few blocks from the river, a quiet building with peeling paint and a kind landlord who handed me the keys without asking who I was trying to impress. I carried my boxes up in slow trips, set a pot and a pan on the stove, laid a single set of sheets on the bed, and opened the window to let in the warm breeze that smelled faintly of water and trees. No one looked twice at my old car in the alley. No one glanced at my shoes or my dress. People nodded when they passed me on the sidewalk and said hello, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I felt my shoulders drop from around my ears, as if I had been braced for judgment so long that I did not remember how to stand without it. On my second afternoon, I wandered into a small bookstore tucked between a cafe and a plant shop. The bell on the door rang, and a woman with quick eyes and a warm voice looked up from behind the counter. She asked what I liked to read. I told her anything that felt honest. She smiled and handed me a paperback with a faded cover, then asked where I was from. I said I had just moved and was looking for a place to belong. She stuck out her hand and said her name was Rita. When I told her mine, she said, "Linda, I could use someone like you a few mornings a week if you want it. It is not much, but it is steady, and you look like you respect books." I laughed softly at that because of all the things I had carried. Respect was one that had not worn thin. I said yes, and just like that, I had a place to be. The work was simple and kind. I shelved new arrivals, dusted surfaces that did not mind a little neglect, and helped a child find a story about a dog that would not give up. Mornings passed in a soft rhythm of pages and quiet voices. Sometimes Rita would brew coffee, and we would talk about books and the way some stories feel like a hand on your back, steadying you when you think you might fall. No one asked where I had come from or what I had left behind. No one tried to decide what I should be. They only saw a woman who showed up on time, who listened, who smiled. In this town, the currency was not status, but small kindnesses. A neighbour carried a box up my stairs without being asked. A stranger held a door. The man at the corner store learned my name by the third visit and asked how I was doing as if he expected a real answer. I began to walk by the river after work, moving at a pace that felt like breathing. I watched the water change with the light, soft green in the afternoon deeper near evening. I sat on a bench and looked at my own hands, the same hands that had picked up extra shifts for years, and I let myself picture them doing something gentler. One day, a flyer on the community board in the bookstore caught my eye. Beginner art class, no experience needed. I took a slip with the address and stood there for a minute with my heart in my throat, surprised by my own longing. I had not drawn anything since before Michael was born. The first night I walked into the studio, I almost turned around. The room smelled of paper and paint, and there were a dozen people standing at easels, all of them concentrating, none of them looking at me. The teacher, a woman with silver hair pulled back in a low bun, handed me a pencil and said, "The lines do not have to be perfect, they only have to be yours." I laughed under my breath and began to draw. My lines wobbled and crossed, but somewhere in the quiet of that room, I remembered what it felt like to try something simply because it made me feel alive. I left with graphite on my fingers and a lightness in my chest I had not felt in years. On a Saturday, I walked past a second-hand shop and saw a large armchair in the window. The fabric was worn in a way that felt like a welcome. I went inside, pressed my hand into the cushion, and pictured it by my window with a book on the arm and a small lamp behind it. I bought it, and the owner helped me carry it up the stairs. We set it down in the centre of my living room, and I stood there looking at it with a mix of pride and relief. For years, I had sat where others placed me. This seat was mine, chosen by me for me. That night, I brewed tea and sank into the chair with the book Rita had given me. The room was quiet but not empty. The window let in a whisper of warm air. I read until my eyes grew tired, then closed the book and rested my palms on the arms of the chair. I said out loud, "I am here. I am Linda." And that is enough. In the weeks that followed, I kept my days simple. I worked at the bookstore, took my art class, walked by the river, and learned the names of the people who smiled at me in the mornings. I cooked easy meals, cleaned as I went, and felt a steady peace settle over my evenings, like a soft blanket. I did not check old messages. I did not reopen doors that had closed on me. My phone had a new number, and I gave it only to the people who used my name without asking me to shrink. Sometimes I thought of Michael and felt a dull ache move through me like a slow tide. I let it come and I let it pass. I had loved him with everything I had, and I still wished him well, but I no longer mistook love for permission to disappear. When the ache eased, I would look around my small living room at the armchair by the window and the sketchbook open on the table, and remember that a life can be built from quiet choices. It does not have to please a room full of people. It only has to fit the person who lives it. One evening, Rita locked up the store and walked with me to the corner. She said, "You look different, Linda, like someone who finally set something heavy down." I smiled and told her I had, and I thanked her for hiring me without asking me to be anyone but myself. She squeezed my shoulder and said, "That is the only way I hire." Later that night, I sat in my chair and watched the last light fade. The room felt full, not with things, but with breath. I whispered, "I am here, I am Linda," and that is enough. I believed it. I closed my eyes and let the quiet hold me. The next afternoon, the bell over the bookstore door rang, and when I looked up, Michael was standing there, thinner than I remembered, his eyes tired, his mouth trying to make a smile that would not come. Rita glanced at me from behind the counter, a question in her gaze. I nodded once and told him we would talk next door 1 hour. No scenes, and when it was done, we would be done. At the cafe, we chose a small table by the window. I set my bag by my chair and ordered water. He sat across from me, and for a few seconds we only listened to the soft clatter of cups and the low sound of other people's easy conversations. He started with apologies that ran into explanations, and then slid back into blame. He said he had been nervous at the wedding that he was performing, that the joke came out wrong, that everyone was laughing, and he followed along. He said Claire's family cared about appearances, that he felt pushed, that the weeks after were a blur of expectations and small disasters. He said he had said terrible things in emails because he was scared. He said he was not thinking straight. He said so much that the words piled up between us like luggage no one wanted to claim. I listened without interrupting. When he reached for my hand, I pulled back gently and folded my fingers together in my lap. For a moment, he looked like a boy again, the boy who once needed me to tie his shoes and button his shirts. Then his face tightened, and he tried another door, one that felt familiar and dangerous. He leaned forward, lowered his voice, and said, "I miss my mum." The words landed in me and echoed through years I could not get back. I let the echo fade, then I answered softly but clearly, "No, Michael. You miss your wallet. Your mum has been gone to you for years." He flinched as though I had struck him. His eyes filled and then hardened. He tried again, saying he knew he had hurt me, that things had gotten out of hand, that the lawyer email was a mistake, that he would fix it, that he would talk to Claire, that he would make her understand that if I could help, just for a little while, he would get on his feet and then pay me back. He promised he would change. He promised he would call more. He promised he would set boundaries with the Whitmores. He promised so many things I could feel the old rhythm trying to pull me under the rhythm, where I said yes, where I fixed, where I handed over my life for his comfort. I took a breath and let the pull pass by. I told him I had listened, and now it was my turn to speak, and that when I finished, I would leave. I said I did not doubt that he felt pressure, or that he had been unkind because others were watching, but that none of it changed the truth. I said, love without respect is not love. It is convenience, and that for a long time I had made that convenience possible, because I thought that was what mothers did. He started to interrupt, but I held up a hand, and he fell quiet. I said, I have returned to myself, and there is no place for you there anymore. He stared at me, as if I were speaking a language he did not know. I kept my voice gentle. I told him I wanted him to build a good marriage and a good life, but that I would not fund either. I told him the house was sold and the money was mine to live on, that there would be no loans, no secret payments, no quiet rescues. I pulled a small envelope from my bag and placed it on the table. Inside, I said, are copies of the sale confirmation and the final bank statement. Keep them if you need proof. I also reached into my bag and set down a worn key on the envelope, the spare he had slipped into my purse years ago after a flat tire on a dark road. You left this once, I said. I kept it because I thought it meant you needed me. Now I am returning it because I do not. He sat very still, his hands flat on the table, his eyes fixed on the key. He said he could change. He said he would find a therapist. He said he would apologize in front of everyone if that is what it took. He said he would put my picture on the wall of his new place, so I would always be there. He reached for my hand again, and I let my palms rest on the table where he could see them, but not hold them. I told him I wanted him to grow, but not as the price of my life. I said I hoped one day he would learn the difference between love and gratitude, and that if that day ever came, he could write me a letter, and I would consider reading it. I told him I would not meet again to reopen this wound, and that my number was private for a reason. I said I wished him well, truly, and I meant it. Then I placed a few dollars beneath my glass of water and thanked the server. At the door, he said Mom, and I turned. For a moment, I saw the boy he had been and the man he might still become. I nodded, once a small ball, to what had been good between us, and then I stepped outside into the savannah light. Rita stood across the way, leaning on the bookstore doorframe, watching with a quiet pride that felt like a hand on my back. I walked toward her, my breath even my shoulders light. I told her I was all right. She squeezed my arm and said she knew. I went back to the counter and straightened a stack of paperbacks, while the bell over the door chimed softly for someone else. As I worked, I felt no shaking in my hands, no ache in my chest, only this steady peace that comes when a choice is made and kept. I had chosen myself, and I kept my choice. I walked home from the bookstore with the sun soft on my shoulders, and my breath even turned the key, and stood for a moment in the doorway as the quiet rose to meet me. It did not feel empty. It felt like a welcome. I set my bag on the table, slipped off my shoes, and let my eyes settle on the armchair by the window. For weeks it had sat there halfway between the light and the wall, as if still asking permission to belong. Tonight I decided it would ask no more. I set the kettle on, then gripped the sides of the chair and edged it across the floor until it stood in the centre of the room, steady and sure, the small lamp angled behind it so the light fell, where I would read and draw. I turned the rug with my foot just a quarter turn, and the room shifted in a way I felt more than saw. This was my seat now. Not in the shadows, not by the door. In the middle where my life happens. When the water sang, I poured tea, carried the cup to the table, and unwrapped a simple frame I had bought on my way home. Inside, a large envelope lay the photo Margaret had taken that night, the emerald gown catching the light as if it had learned how to hold it. I placed the picture on the table and wrote a line on a plain white card, my hand slow and careful. Not just a mother, a woman. I slid the card beneath the photo, fixed the mat over both, and closed the frame with a quiet click. Then I stood on a small step stool, tapped a nail into the wall, and hung the frame so it looked down over my chair like a kind face. The light from the lamp touched the glass. I stepped back and studied it, not as a stranger might, but as someone who had earned this sight. I brewed a second cup of tea and let the steam warm my face. The rest of the evening was simple. I opened the window a little to invite the air, straightened the book stacked on the shelf, and laid my sketchbook on the side table with a pencil across it. Tomorrow I would open the shop with Rita, help a child find a story, ring up a book for a man who always asked for something brave and true, and after work I would walk by the river to watch the light swim across the water until the day folded into itself. In this town, no one cared what car I drove or what dress I wore. People cared whether you looked them in the eye and said hello. That was enough. I sat in my chair and felt the cushion shaped to me. There was no banquet here, no head table, no stage where I had to perform a role to be allowed a seat. Only a small home, a quiet job, a few neighbours who knew my name, and this photo to remind me that when I chose to show up as myself, the world did not end. It opened. I read a few pages, then closed the book and laid my hand on the cover. My other hand went to the sketchbook, and I drew the first line I saw in my mind, a slow arc that did not need to be perfect. It only needed to be mine. I thought of the folder in the back of the closet, labelled done, and felt no pull to touch it. I thought of the cafe, the key returned, the envelope left on the table, and the way my feet had carried me out into the light without shaking. I thought of the words beneath the photo and spoke them in a quiet voice, not to convince myself, but to honour what had changed. Not just a mother, a woman. The words settled into the room as if they had finally found the right place to rest. Later, I turned off the lamp and stood in the dimness a moment longer. The chair sat where I had placed it, patient and sure. The framed photo held its small glow. I pressed my palm to the back of the chair and felt the fabric give under my touch. I remembered the long road that brought me here, the cold plate, the table near the kitchen doors, the way my name had been reduced to a place card and a duty, and I remembered standing in a room full of faces, raising my glass and saying the plain truth out loud. I do not need that room anymore to tell me who I am. I do not need its permission to sit. I have given that to myself. When I lay down to sleep, the apartment breathed with me. In the morning, I would wake and choose again, not with a speech, but with the angle of a lamp, the turn of a rug, the walk to work the kindness offered, and received the steady return to this chair at day's end. I no longer sit at table 8 in the shadows. I sit here at the centre of my life. And that is enough.